G'day everyone. Welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. It's good to have you back with us, and I hope you've been enjoying the content that you've seen so far on our program. Today I'm doing another one of our pop-ups, which is in the context of the issuing of the interim report on the Royal Commission into the atrocities that occurred at Bondi on the 14th of December 2025. Really, it's important to remember the context of that 55 of our fellow Australians were shot, 15 of them tragically killed. But of course, the consequences for the families of those who have lost their loved ones and those who carry the injuries and will require continuing support must be borne in mind and kept in our hearts throughout this whole process. But the key here for me is, you might remember, we had a lot of debate and argument about whether there should even be a Royal Commission. And my view on that was, of course, that there were so many things that needed to be embraced with this. It was a national issue, not a state issue, because that threat of terrorism and the dynamics and the ecosystem of terrorism applies equally right across the nation. And, of course, the issues around radicalisation and extremism as well. To my mind, the key issues were not just about the questions of how we deal with the technical and practical challenges of terrorism, but how we deal with the long-term strategic fight against anti-Semitism and radical ideologies. Obviously, those short-term tactical issues are important in terms of what capabilities and capacity the agencies have to come to grips with these types of threats, and that was a major concern for me. I was not comfortable or sure that we were going to get to the answers to all these questions unless we had a full-scope Royal Commission. I was actually reassured when the government announced the appointment of Dennis Richardson to do the agency evaluation and analysis of that side of the story. And I have had every confidence in Dennis Richardson. I've worked with him, and I knew that he would be across and that he would reach out to seek the information that was important in that space. I also had hoped that he might roll into the Royal Commission to continue through to the end in December to make sure those things were adequately addressed and articulated in the final Royal Commission report. It's been pretty distressing, actually, to see that he's no longer with the Royal Commission, and I really deeply wondered whether or not we were going to see that type of expert analysis in respect to the agency capacity. Reading the interim report, I am reassured that at least some of the critical issues that I was really vigorously referring to in the early days of this discussion have been teased out to a degree in the interim report, and we'll cover off on some of those today. Effectively, it's a 159-page document, so it's a bit of reading, but just to summarise effectively how it's built, it begins, of course, with looking at a number of issues around the events themselves, communications between the Jewish Community Security Service, CSG, and the New South Wales Police. And it looks particularly deeply at things around the machinery of government and relationship issues of the agencies. And obviously there's a lot of suggestions around that machinery of government aspect, and also issues to do with what they call match fitness for managing a counter-terrorism incident. But my primary focus is how we prevent these things from happening in the first place. What we want to see is the entire mindset that enables this type of terrorism to occur, the types of battles of the landscape of the mind that have been missing in recent years in fighting the scourge of anti-Semitism in particular, and how do we address that? And so there are a lot of things that I want to see come out of this Royal Commission, but the aspects that they dealt with to do with the capacity of the agencies and the way they exchange information was very informative, and also the nature of how radicalisation occurs. So I think one comment straight out of the gate is interesting to surface, which is that of the Director General of Security, who said in February of 2025 that the nation was facing an era of strategic surprise and security fragility. And the security fragility applies just as much to the domestic scene and how the efforts exist to undermine our safety and security and our social cohesion from external players. Highly intentional, highly deliberative plan of action and well resourced and supported by state-of-the-art technology, particularly as it relates to exploiting the social media space, and we'll come back to talk about that as we proceed. But the aspect of this that I talked a lot about in the lead up to the Royal Commission's creation was the issue of the information exchange amongst the agencies. So it has been highlighted in this report that counter-terrorism investigations depend on law enforcement and intelligence agencies sharing information effectively. And the sort of things that I commented on were the fact that a lot of the key data points out there in being able to fight counter-terrorism or prevent it in the first place relate to digitising those data points and networking them effectively amongst all of the key players, operators, analysts that really need to be able to join those dots. It is a bit like hunting for a needle in a haystack. So how do we actually achieve that? And are our agencies equipped to do that? And can they share information effectively? And in the report, they talk about the need to do that, but then they also highlighted that, and I'll quote from the report, improvement in the way information concerning counter-terrorism investigations and monitoring is shared may require national consultation and coordination. Well, we've been talking about that, and certainly it's been my experience of working in this space for decades, and still it remains problematic. We also have, of course, issues related to the legal issue requirements and limitations on the ability of agencies to share information, and that's surfaced in the report too, where they said the capacity of agencies to share information is affected by law, for example, the Privacy Act, and by internal policy and authorising frameworks, such as agreements with other agencies. So it is quite a limitation. So there's a limitation on what agencies feel they're able to share under their legal mandates. And of course, there are different dynamics here. An intelligence agency is looking for things that concern operational needs and relate to potentially, depending on whether it's domestic, like the Australian Criminal Investigation Commission, Criminal Intelligence Commission, and then there's the aspects of what ASIO does in translating a lot of the actions of foreign states in interfering domestically, and of course what we see in relation to the overseas intelligence operations that relate to the military security aspect of our nation's security. So the passage of information amongst all of those players and their respective acronyms and organisations in the national intelligence community is really critical. And part of that means you have to find a way to share information in real time that gives you immediate pop-up alerts and information, joining those dots that we talked about. So, for example, in relation to Bondi, right from the start, we've had the bright red thread that the youngest of the perpetrators had been sympathetic and had aligned himself with ISIS ideology. And that's obviously a real red warning light. And of course, because nothing emerged from a point of view of direct action from that in relation to that individual, then the agencies have to determine where they apply resources, and decisions were made about application of precious resources, particularly human resources. A lot of that is manpower intensive. These days, of course, it comes back to how technology can help you transcend that limitation, and I'll talk more about that. But in this particular instance, effectively, a constant watch and monitoring wasn't maintained, and the aspects of how that person related more broadly were not able to be monitored. And one of the things that really inhibits that, that's surfaced in the report, is the question of the National Firearms Register. And you might remember the incident in Queensland in 2022 involving the deaths of the police officers, a tragic incident, really surfaced the problems with firearms moving across borders. And it's now 2026 and we still have not got the National Firearms Register in place in terms of the full technical capability. And there are still policing jurisdictions out there which are doing firearms registering and processes hydraulically on their paper exercises. And so there are real limitations on effective and efficient networking of that information. So the urgency is there for that. And in fact, the Royal Commission interim report did say in relation to this that there is an issue as to whether or not this timetable of 2028 that they're referring to of completing the National Firearms Register is unduly leisurely, is the expression used by the report. And I guess that's a very clear signal that we have to accelerate this. And as I've mentioned before, the technology to do it exists, but the ability of our bureaucracies and decision makers to properly assess how they deploy, where they get the market options, or whether they do things in-house is just a minefield of failures and misfires all through the recent history of our agencies and defence. And I've noticed how the United States can effectively work its way through these things when it has the resources that the US has to draw on to do those kind of evaluation processes, which we don't have that capability here in Australia. So we are behind the eight ball already from that point of view. But the urgency needs to be amplified there. We need to respond to the prods from the Royal Commission and make all of that happen much more quickly in relation to the National Firearms Registry. The key point about that being that the father of the younger perpetrator in this atrocity was able to acquire 6 firearms with no questions asked, and that issue and that state of affairs not being immediately brought to the attention of operators. Other later data points about, travel to the southern Philippines and who the young perpetrator and the older perpetrator might have been engaging with in terms of radicalising agents within that ecosystem of generating the ideology and motivation behind terrorist incidents like this. People like Wissam Haddad from the Al Madinah Dawa Centre in Sydney, obviously a very critical incubator for the types of mindsets of basically generating a concept or a view of Jews that they aren't human, that the texts of Islam, like the Hadith, require Muslims to go out and kill Jews ultimately. So that kind of instruction and indoctrination isn't monitored as closely as it should have been. And we've now seen, the video evidence emerge of the sorts of comments that directly relate to that and inciting violence and hate against the Jewish community. So the data points and the networking and the availability of them to other agencies is really critically important, and it has to be resolved. We really have to find the regimes, and they exist technologically. There are options out there where information sharing can occur with built-in access controls, permissions regimes applied so that you see the information that you need to see, that's properly curated to protect and provide for all the legislative requirements that may exist and privacy issues. So that can include anonymising data in this respect where it's needed to be anonymised. But we can't really fight this battle with one arm tied behind our back. And if we have inhibited ourselves from the proper availability of these tools because of these restrictions, then you just have to find a solution to what those restrictions are and how you work with them. And as I say, the technology exists to do that. So obviously, that issue of legislation was surfaced, and the systems that don't talk to each other was another thing that was obvious from the comments made. They did say that effectively you've got some agencies who can process data very efficiently and effectively, but others that can't. So and that systems that don't talk to each other also make that very hard. So we've got a challenge there, but one that's entirely solvable. Real-time information is very critical in a lot of these things, and the only way you can do that is through the digitisation and systems aspect of reform there. I guess the next issue that we should really zero in on is how this radicalisation process is working. There's an obvious question there in relation to the development of the online means by which that radicalisation occurs. And the situation there was that there's something that's been highlighted in this report, the comments that have been made previously, about the effect and use of that online radicalisation has really amplified recently. So you've got the Australian Institute of Criminology in 2023 highlighting that a significant number of violent extremist offenders, perhaps up to 60%, either radicalise primarily online or have significant online influences in their radicalisation. So the comment was that artificial intelligence, social media, and online gaming even are increasing the scale and volume of violent extremist narratives. So you had the Director General of ASIO himself stating that extremist ideologies, conspiracies, misinformation are flourishing in the online ecosystem, and young Australians are particularly vulnerable. And that's intentional because they are vulnerable, because you have the ability to shape the way they think, etc. That's why they are targeted by the extremists to groom them effectively to become agents of their horror, their violence. So that has festered and evolved into a diverse threat environment susceptible to sudden shifts in response to events. So the use of the radicalisers of international incidents or issues of the day, translated, warped, misinterpreted, whatever they do to it to make it effective, but often current events are utilised as tools, and either artificial or misinterpreted or misrepresented material will be curated into that process. So what used to be a radicalisation period that might take 6 months or a year has now been compressed through this online capability to sometimes periods of days and weeks. So the comment that was made in the report is that in this environment, evolving technology and the near ubiquity of encrypted messaging, which makes it hard to actually track how some of this information, how some of this activity is mobilised, can challenge agencies' ability to detect, investigate, and prevent radicalisation pathways. So here again, there's a need to enhance our technology in how we track these sorts of misuses of social media in particular. These days, as research at the University of Canberra has indicated, most young people do not actively seek out news, and the only way they will encounter it will be as it bumps them in their social media or as it's presented to them in their timelines. And of course, foreign actors like Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea have since 2016 been really coordinating their efforts to exploit that. And an expert that I've conversed with, Melissa Chen, who knows the inside out of TikTok, which is wholly owned by the Chinese Communist Party, and how algorithms are actually constructed to channel those sorts of information streams or misinformation streams. So just recently, in order to support partners on partnerships, such as between China and Iran, the algorithm was constructed to direct anti-Israel material through TikTok. So we have to be aware, and as parents, people should be aware of the threats and risks of platforms like TikTok. I know it's called social media, but I think it's really actually anti-social media. But this is one of the dimensions that at least I was pleased to see that the Royal Commission has started to identify these things, and hopefully that will become a subject of more focus, because there is a need to really translate that in relation to how some of our influences out there, how particularly people who would claim to be progressive, people on the left who are meant to be intellectuals or experts or at least celebrities, portray positions or describe positions or interpret events to influence people within our community, particularly the young. And I guess one example of how that has gone very badly wrong recently is in the comments made by Grace Tame. Now, no doubt, with her background, she's been fighting a good fight in relation to sexual violence and probably operating from the best of intentions. But the old saying is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And in her situation, she has obviously been targeted, and really this is part of a playbook that the pro-Hamas, pro-Hezbollah, pro-Iran, violent anti-Israel elements out there really go after this very intentionally, very deliberatively, and they are incredibly well funded. The money that comes in from certain quarters, including foreign states like Qatar that fund these things. Estimate is that Qatar has actually poured about $100 billion into the US alone over the last 10 years, particularly to try and shape the tertiary education space. But I saw recent US congressional testimony that indicated they are now kind of targeting the years K to 12 as well. But there's a book that is in French, and I'm hoping that it'll be translated into English as soon as possible. But it was written by a lady by the name of Nora Bassini. She is a half Moroccan Arab Muslim woman, also the other half being French, and she spent a year basically going undercover into the world of the ultra-left in France. And this is her book, and it's called Les Nouveaux Antisemites, so the new anti-Semites, and it really teases out the playbook that is being used here, how they've gone after very deliberatively all sorts of sort of fringe organisations, anything that's actually organised that you can then abuse and use a network for. And in France, it's included like the transgender, the LGBTQI world, etc. And so in penetrating those organisations, they then start shaping the information flow to them and the dialogue. So, and that particularly relates to how they control vocabulary to really shape their propaganda and the conditioning of a mindset. So you're not allowed to refer in their groups to Israel. It has to be the Zionist entity. It's not the IDF, it's the genocide army. And then to peddle all of this terminology around genocide, despite the fact that there is legally no genocide taking place in Gaza. But the relentlessness in which you try and create the consensus around that by people who would normally be considered to be progressives, who are now lining up supporting organisations and terrorist groups and states like Iran who are anything but progressive, that routinely execute LGBTQI, that persecute and deny rights to women, that don't allow free trade unionism or elections. No aspect of their behaviour in society could be described as progressive. And even today, we're watching in Gaza, Hamas, which has been, at the forefront of perpetrating these types of crimes and human rights violations, has executed more than 6,000 Palestinians since the ceasefire occurred, as they had been doing for the last, 18, 19 years in any event. So this really is an amazing achievement to have flipped and inverted reality here. And so when I see Grace Tame stand up in front of a crowd in Sydney, very soon after the Bondi atrocity and used the phraseology that from Gadigal to Gaza, we globalised the intifada. And Gadigal country, of course, is where the atrocity took place. And just to me, that's horrifying to see, horrifying. It's clearly a phrase that is used to promote violence. It is the very phraseology that was used to motivate lots of the perpetrators of terrorist acts, etc. And a lot of the activities that we've seen evolve in Australia over the last 2 years, where we've seen demonstrations that started out as purportedly for peace, and probably people with best of intentions aligned with that, wanting to see ceasefires and ends of wars, etc., but then becoming something much more sinister, and that evolving into arson attacks and vandalism, and then fire bombings of synagogues and childcare centres. And it was on a trajectory which a lot of us highlighted was going to only end in one way, which was in someone being killed. And so what we saw was the completion of that trajectory at Bondi on the 14th of December 2025. So for her to sort of stand up and recycle that and to promote it is deeply disturbing. And it's clear that she's had her opinion shaped, and she's been really manipulated into attitudes around the reality of the situation in their creation of it, such as when she makes comments like that the sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023 in southern Israel, that those allegations have been debunked. And the evidence is so overwhelming. How she could possibly have come to that conclusion just shows you how successful these manipulators and misinformers are. If you looked at the report by the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence to the Secretary General, Pramila Patten, she was very clear about all this. She saw the 5,000 photographs, the 50 hours of videos, etc., and she described the sexual violence, sexual mutilation as horrendous. And it was the details of her report that led to the UN being forced to actually blacklist Hamas as an organisation that employs sexual violence as a weapon of war. Mystifyingly, that hasn't led the UN to actually including Hamas as a terrorist organisation, as it has been in so many countries, such as Australia. And that sort of goes to the faults that exist within the UN organisation as it has evolved, particularly in recent times, and disintegrating as a viable organisation for world peace. But in this respect, Pramila Patten did her work and called it out. And then you've got the work of the UK parliamentary report into this, led by Lord Roberts, which spells it out. The Dinar report that was extensive, detailed, and very forensic on establishing what took place on the 7th of October. So I could refer to multiple other possible sources of information that Grace Tame could have taken advantage of. She could have sat down with one of the victims that could have been arranged for her and have it described to her, the sorts of information that I was able to tease out of the podcast that we had with Mazal Tazazo and what took place on the 7th of October. So the denial of those facts is really disturbing. It really is an Orwellian nightmare of inversion, distortion, invention of a different reality, a parallel universe. And so this is the concerning thing that the Royal Commission has got to get to grips with, is how the background operation behind that works, how those playbooks that Nora Bassini has teased out, how that gets employed and built, and the information warfare aspect to how that social media dimension has been created, the intentional coordination of those foreign actors to create this space, and how they've, cross-reference through their legacy media outlets in the developing world too, to shape how the developing world is developing its attitudes and its politics. and how liberal democracies are being undermined by all this. It's a shrinking space. I think I've referred before, and you might have heard me talk about the VDEM Institute in Gothenburg University that studies democracies and been doing it for decades, and how they highlighted in their last report that we've gone from 48% of the world's population living under autocracies to, as we sit here today, it's now 71%. And there's only, they claim, 13% of us left living in liberal democracies. So we are losing at the moment in this information warfare space, and we must fight back, take advantage of the possibility of cooperating with coalitions of the willing and with the agencies like the Defence Advanced Research Project Agency in the United States, which has 3 projects running at the moment into some of the AI deepfake technological aspects of this, but also the other ways of doing these campaigns, how those influence campaigns are built and how to track them and how to surface them and how to dismember them, and at least provide the ability for people to convey or teach the things that and the techniques that are being used, so that our kids are armed with the ability to have the critical thinking and the source evaluation that will inoculate them against the heinous effects of these campaigns, which are aimed so much at them. And of course, the Royal Commission does highlight the fact that some of the incidents, the anti-Semitic incidents in the last couple of years, were orchestrated and put into effect by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the terrorist arm of the Iranian regime, and the management mechanism for controlling all of that galaxy of proxies that it's used to initiate and prosecute wars, particularly in pursuing their ultimate objective, genocidal objective of destroying the state of Israel and every Jew that lives there and in the rest of the world, because that will then trigger the revelation of the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, and which is the first step towards globalizing Islam. And so that is the ideology, and the IRGC is the key prosecuting arm of that, and their reach, of course, has been felt on our shores, and I was pleased to see the government react to that, respond to that, take the necessary steps of listing it as a terrorist organisation, which is something Australian governments in recent years should have done a long time ago, but it's good to see that happen now, and it has shaped certain attitudes and approaches to how we should be dealing with Iran from a policy point of view. So obviously this report has a lot of elements to it that are confidential. Chapter 5, for example, and some of the recommendations. So we're not going to be privy to those, but I'm hoping that they'll surface, in particular, some of these capacity issues that the agencies have, and that the right funding goes there. We've seen the revelation that, where funding has been provided to our agencies is significant. There's been a significant decline in the proportion of that funding directed at counter-terrorism. We need to see that addressed. We need to see the infrastructure upgrades that will allow the agencies to deploy the state-of-the-art tools that they need to, and to bend those tools to curing our silo issues. I guess the other issue too is that I hope gets teased out is the question around what is it legitimate, what is it sensible to do within a democratic construct like ours in creating the legal frameworks for managing protest and behaviour, in our country, and that you have to be very careful with that, and I fully acknowledge and support that. But what I'm hoping to do is that, or to see happen, is that we look at the things that are directly related to promoting and enabling and facilitating violence. So when you see people talking about filthy Zios or whatever, we know that that's a substitute for filthy Jews. The term Zio was popularized by David Duke back in the 70s. He's the head of the Ku Klux Klan. And we've seen these operators, the Hamas and Hezbollah operators, IRGC, really working hard to promote this kind of terminology, this kind of language enables people to be anti-Semitic without appearing to be obviously so. And part of that, of course, relates to how people will make connections with, okay, it's legitimate to exercise violence against Israel because it's a demonic state, a heinous state, and therefore anybody connected with Israel is equally heinous. And you've seen people make comments that people who were killed at Bondi, for example, deserved it because they are part of, they are loyal to the Zionist entity or support its existence, etc. And the really disgusting commentary about this. And part of that too is around demonstrations being attempted to be held in front of synagogues. So really saying, we're demonstrating against Israel and here we are in front of a synagogue. It means all Jews everywhere are guilty and deserve to die is effectively the subtext to a lot of that, or that can be constructed from that, or can foment and promote that kind of view. So when a government tries to prevent these demonstrations from happening in front of a synagogue, then that should be supported. It's perfectly legitimate for a government to manage how the freedom of speech and protest is conducted. So why should you be at complete liberty to hold a demonstration anywhere you like, in any way, form or shape that can disrupt the safe operation of society? That there's a balance to be had there. And I know that New South Wales Police, for example, have tried mightily to come to understandings with some of the organisers of these pro-Hamas demonstrations to go to spaces that are safer and can be better managed, and where both the demonstrators can be supported properly, but that their impact is not the vehicle for creation of violence. And you can imagine if, say, that members of the Jewish community tried to stage a demonstration in front of the mosque in Lakemba, what might be the outcome of that? And so it's quite often helpful to flip the comparison, flip the narrative, to see what it looks like if you don't use the word Jews or synagogues or Israel in all of this. So that's, I think, a legitimate area that the Royal Commission should look at. What are the sensible limitations that you can apply to demonstrations? Not prohibiting or banning them necessarily, but just, yes, they shouldn't be allowed to take place in front of synagogues, etc. And, at events where violence may occur, you manage it so that the demonstrations can take place peacefully, and where you minimise the risk of violence. So conversations around that, I hope, become part of the Royal Commission going forward. I'm hoping that there'll be an understanding of how that all relates to the ecosystem of terrorism that I've referred to, and how we can neutralise the limitations of our federal structure and improve how we deal with things nationally. That it's been holding us back for too long. I mean, when I first joined the Army, we were just coming to grips with the assignment of the counter-terrorism role to the SAS, the close quarter combat assault role for situations of the kind of typical terrorist acts of that time were hostage taking in strongholds, hijacking of aircraft, etc., threats to key national assets like oil platforms, all that sort of thing we exercised ad nauseum back then. But of course, the threat of terrorism has evolved. That's not to say that incidents like that may not happen. And we saw that happen with Monin, who was responsible for the Lint Cafe siege. But more likely these days, in the disaggregated nature of terrorism, parent organisations and fomenters of atrocities will quite often try and have something that's not hierarchical, it's not vulnerable to penetration and breakdown by enforcement agencies, and have means of communications that might be easily penetrated. What they like to do is just to create that ideological motivation system and network, and then point people in the right direction where they might find information about how to build an explosive improvised device, and also things like, how you find out about key target events where you can do mass casualties, and even how you just go out there with knives, with vehicles, with whatever is at hand to cause death and destruction, like driving a truck through a Christmas market in Germany, or whatever it is, running around with a knife. We saw one wielder of a knife in Bondi Junction be able to kill 6 people, even though that wasn't related to political violence. It can show you the potential of how the simplest of approaches, with the right ecosystem creating the mindset, can generate the sorts of impacts and terror that organisations like the IRGC, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, and other terrorist organisations are motivated to do, that is essential to their ideology and to their mode of operation. So that means of building that ecosystem really needs to be zeroed in on, and also the funding that comes with all of this, the sorts of manipulations that go on our university campuses, and the indoctrinations and the accountability for content, in the academic spheres, that really needs to be looked at as well. So here we are with this interim report. It's limited, of course, because it is interim, and we should accept that. There are some threads in there that are promising, but I really hope that we're not in a world where we just have to keep doubling down on the security that we build around the Jewish community. To me, the word that brings it all to heart is unacceptable. It is unacceptable that the Jewish community of Australia should have to live this way. So there are short-term tactical measures definitely that need to be taken, and the interim report talks about support for securing events and sites and locations and gatherings, etc. But ultimately, it's unacceptable to live this way, that the Jewish community has to live differently from any other community in Australia. And all Australians should reject that, because it won't stop with the Jewish community. The ideologies that we're talking about really believe in this concept of the kafir, the infidels, and that all of those who don't accept Islam in this Islamist extremist construct, will ultimately need to lose their lives if they don't, make that act of acceptance. So at various times they will reach out to targets of opportunity of all kinds against the kafir world, etc. So we have to understand that and appreciate that. The fight starts with the Jewish community at the moment, because they've been the focus and the central target, as we've seen playing out around the world, places like the UK and the United States and through Europe, and the deliberative planning that has gone around a lot of that with Hezbollah cells in Europe, etc., that have been broken up. Thankfully, preventing them from actually achieving or acting on these plans. But look at the trends. The Nova Music Festival, all these beautiful young people just enjoying life and music. It wasn't the first of those. You had, of course, the Bataclan. You saw the Manchester assault. You saw the plans to attack the Taylor Swift concerts in Austria. These people hate that kind of free culture and music, etc. So it's an obvious target for them, but also something that creates a lot of news. So that's the point about this. It starts in one place with the Jewish community, but it doesn't end there. And we need to all be invested in making sure that our Australian Jewish community doesn't have to live this way. And so I think that's the strategic long-term thing. And I'll finish with how we might address that, which is education. The old Aristotelian concepts of education are summarised in that phrase that give me the child until they're 7 and I'll give you the adult. And we have the opportunity, or should be taking the opportunity, to ensure we're inoculating our kids in those critical years of development of their moral compass and character traits, and really intentionally go out, as Aristotle would say, to build the polis you want to see through education and instilling moral virtues and intelligent wisdom, etc. And this is what we're trying to do with the National Holocaust Memorial Education Centre project here in the ACT, where we get 165,000 kids visit here every year, and they're mostly in that age bracket from years 11 to say 7, and so the 11 to 15 age bracket is the key one. There's about 88% of that 165,000 come from that age bracket of 11 to 15. So what we need to do is to work out as a standard component of curricula nationwide and how we train teachers effectively to do this. And we want to experiment with that with this centre as an innovation hub and a laboratory, working with the University of Canberra, its education faculty, hopefully, so that lessons and learnings can be taken nationwide. But to get in there and make sure that we're looking at those virtues and character traits that we want to see in an Australian citizen, the moral courage and the intention around acting when you see something wrong, and of having the understanding of how a society, a caring and a safe society is built. So hopefully this will be something that the Royal Commission looks at as well, in terms of that long-term strategic battle of creating the society that we want, rather than just these short-term tactical issues of how we get match fit for managing a counter-terrorism incident and how we actually prevent them from the agency point of view, and what protections need to be put in place for the Jewish community in the short term. Important as all that is, critical as all that is, because that's about saving lives in the short term. And I'd emphasise this, that the people that committed those atrocities at Bondi, there are people out there right now with exactly the same mindset, with exactly the same access to weapons, and with exactly the same ability to get precursor materials for improvised explosive devices. Our agencies are not properly equipped to keep tabs on all of that right now. And it begins with us intentionally building the digitisation of those critical data points and networking them effectively, and making all of that real time so responses can be immediate. So those are the things I'd like to emphasise, and looking forward to seeing the ultimate report here and in contributing to the Royal Commission process. And I hope all of you are taking any advantage you can to contribute in any way that reflects on perhaps your experience of othering and anti-Semitism in your daily lives. All of it will be important for the Royal Commission to do its job. So thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you again next time on Frontlines and Faultlines. Cheers.